So today's history, you should have read yesterday about life in America during the First World War. I would say that life in America, even though it changed, is very similar to what we have today in the fact that our life has changed greatly. Now, we don't have the number of deaths that they did during World War One, and it is not something where all the action is happening in other parts of the world. It's actually happening in this area, but there were similar things there. As far as the history for today, we have pages 249 to 251. Now, on the original syllabus, I have that we're doing a quiz all the way up through 248, from 241 to 248, but I'm going to add in up through 251, mainly because those are the last three pages, and next Tuesday when we have our history test, I wanted to be able to include those pages. In fact, probably won't see very many questions, if at all, from the previous pages that you read yesterday, from 246 to 248. Probably not see too many questions from that. There may be one or two, but as far as in the test, you might see one in the quiz, possibly two. But for the most part, we'll probably have more questions from this last part here of the this last section here. And what we're going to do is we're going to read it together, and I may make some comments as we go along. So get your books out and turn to page 249. Just drop something here, okay? 249, and it says this: the end of the war, armistice. The fighting officially ended on November 11th, 1918, after the Meuse-Argonne offensive. I don't know how that's pronounced. Probably Meuse-Argonne offensive, because it is French. So the Germans agreed to an armistice. Germany was in a desperate state. Its ruler, Kaiser Wilhelm II, had fled to Holland and was about to give up his reign. The Allies had cut off supplies to Germany, and the German people were starving. Historians estimate that nearly 65% of Germany's forces had been wounded, taken prisoner, or killed by the end of the war. Weary German leaders met with Foch in a railroad car in a forest of France. They signed the armistice, putting an end to 4 years of warfare. The armistice ended the fighting, but the war was not yet over, or not over yet. The leaders of the nations involved still needed to work out the details of the peace treaty. Even so, the day of the armistice was a holiday for the Allies. Allied soldiers laid down their weapons, took off their gas masks, and climbed out of their trenches. They cried and laughed and slapped each other on the back. In Allied nations around the world, people went wild with joy. They ran out into the streets, cheering, singing, dancing, and waving flags. Armistice Day became a national holiday in the United States. Later, it became known as Veterans Day. Look at the picture up there. It says, "We shall never shake the world together, you and I, for you gave your life away. And I think my heart was broken by war, since on a summer day you took the road we never spoke of." It's from a thing. It says a Cannon was a British nurse who served. This is the writer of this poem, who served in France. Her fiancé fought in the war, and he survived the war but died shortly after from influenza. And that influenza, which I gave as a bonus question from last week, was Spanish flu. And the Spanish flu started in 1918, and it was a pandemic and spread around, and more people died from the Spanish flu than died from World War I. And so it was a kind of an amazing thing. Continue reading. But for many families, there was sadness too. Millions of wounded were coming home. They would need special care. Many would have disabilities for the rest of their lives. And more than 115,000 American soldiers would never come home. Rows and rows of white crosses on European battlefields were silent reminders of the high cost of peace. The Treaty of Versailles, on the next page, 250. Christmas came and went. In America, the celebration was a mixture of joy and sorrow. Yet many Christians thanked God for the new peace on the earth and prayed that it would last. In January of 1919, the peace conference began in Paris, France. Leaders from many different nations gathered to discuss the peace treaty. The most important leaders at the conference were Georges Clemenceau of France, David Lloyd George of Britain, Vittorio Orlando of Italy, and Woodrow Wilson of the United States. They were known as the Big Four. Germany's leaders were not part of the discussion. Most of the Allied nations blamed Germany for the war. Many wanted to see the treaty punish Germany, but not all the leaders agreed on the treaty's terms. Clemenceau wanted the treaty to be severe on Germany. He did not want the Germans ever to be a threat to other nations again. Lloyd George did not want to be quite so harsh. He wanted to decrease Germany's power, but he did not want to leave it powerless. Lloyd George saw that communism was growing in Russia. He wanted Germany to be able to stand in the way of its growth. President Wilson had given the treaty much thought. He had formed 14 points that he wanted it to include. These points were meant to keep the world at peace. Wilson cared most about one of the points concerning a League of Nations. This league would be an international organization that would work together for peace and security. And so you see there a picture or a drawing of the Big Four meeting in France at a place called the Hall of Mirrors to discuss and sign the peace treaty. You can see why it's called the Hall of Mirrors. You see the picture in there of the mirrors that are there on the wall. In the end, the treaty did not include most of Wilson's 14 points, but it did include the League of Nations. The treaty also required Germany to pay enormous costs for damages to the Allied nations. It took away large portions of Germany's territory. It forced Germany to greatly limit the number of military men and warships it could have. On June 28, 1919, German leaders met with the Allies in the Palace of Versailles in Paris. They signed the treaty in the Hall of Mirrors. The treaty became known as the Treaty of Versailles. Some people, including Lloyd George and Foch, thought that the treaty was too harsh to Germany. They did not believe the treaty had settled matters in a way that would keep peace. They were concerned that Europe would have to fight another war. Time would prove them to be right. After the treaty, President Wilson returned to the United States. He was eager for Congress to ratify the treaty, but some congressmen were not pleased with it. They did not believe that the United States should be involved in a League of Nations. They felt that being in a league would threaten America's independence. Wilson traveled and made many speeches promoting the League. The United States never ratified the treaty and never joined the League of Nations. With the war over, most Americans wanted nothing more than for life to return to normal, but they would feel the impact of World War I for a long time to come. In the next decade, American author Ernest Hemingway wrote about the lost generation. He was not only speaking of the young men who had died in the war, he was also referring to the war's effect on the hearts and minds of many of those who had lived through it. Many American young people struggled to recover a feeling of hope and purpose in life after the terrible war. More than ever, Americans needed the peace of God to keep their hearts and minds secure. So, why did the United States never approve the Treaty of Versailles? Well, they give you some answers there that people were concerned about, in particular the League of Nations, which was a part of the Treaty of Versailles, that we would lose our independence. That was probably the primary reason. In spite of the fact, you see, Woodrow Wilson was one of the major progressives during the early 1900s, and the progressive movement basically was trying to move not only the United States, but many of the countries around the world into less independence and more interdependence, which means that they would depend on each other around the world. In other words, man was the answer to man's problems. And of course, this also drives people, or drove people many times, to start to depend on themselves and not to depend on God. And so that, I think at that time we had many, many more Christians and people who understood that dangerous thought and dangerous feeling. And so that's what is going on. And this is the end of this chapter. Now, we'll get into the Roaring Twenties and the Depressing 30s, and you see that lost generation in that section when we get to it starting next Wednesday. The lost generation would be a type of people who were concerned about basically one thing. In the 1920s in particular, it was called the Roaring Twenties. In the 1920s, everything changed in the United States as far as culture. It really had a big difference, and that's not an uncommon thing after war. In fact, after World War II, we had a similar thing happen in the 1950s, but it really established itself in the 1960s and the 1970s with the hippie movement in the 1960s and protests and all the different things that had occurred during that time as far as the culture was concerned. Authority was less respected, and the way that things were in the United States changed now forever. And you see it still reflected even today, because it took us on a downward path that we had not been on before. And we had already been on it, I guess, since the late 1800s, early 1900s, because of philosophers of that time basically saying that scientifically that we were animals, we were not creations of God. And that thought and that belief started to become more prevalent in our country, but really took off especially during the 1960s and 1970s, and a steeper slope that we had gone down. All right, that's your assignment. Now, for the quiz for next Monday, when we have that, I'm going to give you in the history for that day, I will give you an understanding of what kind of questions or what the questions should be on there. And so for Monday, when you do that, watch the video first. Then you can go and take that history quiz, and then I will also be giving you the packet that you'll get in the packet, the practice test for history, and then you can do that on Monday. That will be your assignment for Monday, do the practice test, and then Tuesday we'll take the actual test. All right, that's it. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend. Thanks a lot. Bye.